The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor, as Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom window. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the phone, listening to the voice on the other end deliver news that would shake the very foundation of the royal family. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. A tragic accident had claimed the lives of an entire family during their visit to one of the royal patronages. William found her there 20 minutes later, still clutching the phone, tears streaming down her face. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The look in her eyes told him everything. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around his wife, feeling her body shake with quiet sobs. They had seen tragedy before, had comforted grieving families, and attended memorials, but something about this felt different. Perhaps it was the ages of the children involved, or the fact that the family had been on their way to a charity event that Catherine herself had organized. The Hartwell family had been beloved members of their community in Manchester. David Hartwell, a construction worker who had lost his job during the economic downturn, had found new purpose volunteering at a local food bank. His wife Sarah taught primary school and spent her weekends organizing reading programs for underprivileged children. Their 3 children, Emma, aged 7, James, aged 5, and baby Lucy, just 18 months old, were known throughout their neighborhood for their bright smiles and kind hearts. They had been driving to London for a special event at one of Catherine's charitable organizations when their car was struck by a drunk driver on the motorway. The impact was devastating. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. But it was too late. The drunk driver walked away with minor injuries, while an entire family was lost in an instant. News of the tragedy spread quickly through social media and local news outlets. Here was a family who had been struggling financially, but still gave their time to help others. They had been traveling to an event meant to celebrate community spirit and kindness when their lives were cut short by someone's reckless decision. William and Catherine spent the morning in their private office, reading every detail they could find about the Hartwell family. They learned about David's quiet heroism during a flood 2 years earlier when he had helped evacuate elderly residents from a care home. They read about Sarah's innovative teaching methods that had helped struggling students improve their reading skills. They saw photos of the children playing in their small garden, their faces bright with joy and innocence. Catherine found herself particularly moved by a photo of little Emma wearing a handmade crown at a school play. The girl's smile reminded her so much of her own daughter, Charlotte. The thought of her own children losing their lives in such a senseless way made her stomach turn. She couldn't imagine the pain the extended Hartwell family must be feeling. By afternoon, flowers and messages had begun appearing outside the gates of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. People who had never met the Hartwell family felt compelled to express their grief and sympathy. Social media was flooded with tributes and calls for justice. The drunk driver had been arrested, but that brought little comfort to anyone. The royal communications team suggested a standard statement of condolence, the kind of measured response the palace typically issued for such tragedies. But both William and Catherine felt that wasn't enough. This family had died while traveling to support one of their charitable causes. They felt a personal responsibility to do more than simply issue a statement. That evening, as they tucked their own children into bed, Catherine couldn't help but hold each of them a little tighter. George, Charlotte, and Louis went to sleep, unaware that their parents were grappling with how to respond to such a devastating loss. William and Catherine sat in their living room long into the night, discussing what they could do that would truly honor the Hartwell family's memory. The next morning brought more heartbreaking details about the family. Local news interviews revealed the impact the Hartwells had made in their community. Neighbors spoke of David helping elderly residents with their shopping during lockdown, never accepting payment for his kindness. Sarah's colleagues shared stories of her staying late to help struggling students, often using her own money to buy books for children who couldn't afford them. One particularly moving interview was with an elderly woman named Margaret, who lived next door to the family. Through her tears, she described how Emma and James would visit her every Sunday, bringing her drawings they had made and staying to chat about their week at school. Baby Lucy had just started walking and would toddle over to Margaret's garden fence, giggling and waving her tiny hands. These stories painted a picture of a family who truly embodied the values that William and Catherine tried to promote through their charitable work. The irony that they had died while traveling to support such work was not lost on anyone. It felt like a cruel twist of fate that highlighted just how unfair life could be. Catherine spent much of that second day working with her team to learn more about the charity event the Hartwells had been traveling to attend. It was a celebration of community volunteers, people who gave their time freely to help others. David had been nominated for his work at the food bank, while Sarah was being recognized for her reading programs. They had been so excited about the recognition, according to friends. Not for themselves, but because it might inspire others to volunteer. As William read through more details about the family's volunteer work, he was struck by how much they had given, despite having so little. David's supervisor at the food bank mentioned that he often stayed late to help load deliveries, refusing overtime pay and instead asking that the money be donated to purchase more food for families in need. Sarah had used her own savings to buy winter coats for students whose families couldn't afford them. The public response continued to grow throughout the day. A crowdfunding page set up for the family's funeral expenses had raised more money than needed within hours. People began organizing their own memorial events in cities across the country. The tragedy had touched something deep in the national consciousness, perhaps because it represented the loss of the very best of human nature. By evening, William and Catherine knew they had to do something significant. The standard royal response felt inadequate for a family who had given so much and asked for so little in return. They began planning something that would not only honor the Hartwell family but might also inspire others to carry on their legacy of kindness and community service. The third day, after the tragedy, dawned gray and somber, matching the mood that had settled over the nation. William and Catherine had made their decision during a sleepless night of planning and soul-searching. They would travel to Manchester unannounced, without the usual royal protocol and media fanfare. This wouldn't be an official royal visit with carefully orchestrated photo opportunities. Instead, it would be two parents paying their respects to another family, human beings honoring human beings. Catherine's lady-in-waiting was surprised when she received the call at dawn. The princess wanted to wear her own clothes, not a formal outfit chosen by stylists. She selected a simple black dress, one she might wear to a friend's funeral, and her grandmother's pearl earrings. William chose a plain, dark suit without any military decorations or royal insignia. They wanted to blend in as much as possible, to be just another couple coming to pay their respects. The drive to Manchester was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. Catherine had spent the early morning hours writing a personal letter to the Hartwell family's relatives. In it, she shared her own experiences as a mother, her fears and hopes for her children, and her admiration for the love and values David and Sarah had instilled in their children despite their difficult circumstances. When they arrived at the modest, terraced street where the Hartwells had lived, they were struck by the scene before them. The small front garden had been transformed into a shrine of flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes, and children's drawings. The neighboring houses had similar displays, creating a rainbow of color against the gray brick facades. Local residents moved quietly among the tributes, adding their own messages or simply standing in silent reflection. William and Catherine parked their car several streets away and walked to the house, their personal protection officers maintaining a discreet distance. As they approached, a few people recognized them, but instead of the usual excitement that accompanied royal sightings, there was only respectful acknowledgement. This was a place of mourning, and everyone understood the solemnity of the moment. An elderly woman emerged from the house next door, moving slowly with the aid of a walking stick. Catherine immediately recognized her as Margaret, the neighbor who had been interviewed on television. Without hesitation, Catherine approached her, introducing herself simply as Kate and expressing her condolences. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she invited them into her small sitting room. The next hour was one of the most profound conversations either William or Catherine had experienced. Margaret shared intimate stories about the Hartwell family that hadn't made it into the news reports. She told them about the Sunday mornings when Emma would bring her wildflowers picked from the local park, carefully arranged in a jam jar. She described James's habit of leaving smooth stones he had found on her windowsill, each one chosen for its perfect shape or interesting color. Margaret showed them a photograph album filled with pictures the children had drawn for her. Stick figure families with enormous smiles, houses with flowers in every window, and rainbows that stretched across entire pages. Each drawing was signed with wobbly letters and decorated with hearts and stars. Lucy's contribution was a handprint in purple paint, her tiny fingers spread wide in what Sarah had called her butterfly hand. Catherine found herself fighting back tears as Margaret described the last time she had seen the family. They had stopped by on their way out of town, all dressed in their best clothes and excited about their trip to London. David had worn his only suit, carefully pressed for the occasion. Sarah had curled Emma's hair and tied it with a yellow ribbon that matched her dress. James had insisted on wearing his school shoes because they were the smartest ones he owned. Margaret mentioned that Sarah had been worried about the long drive, as their car was old and had been giving them trouble. But they couldn't afford to miss the ceremony, and the train tickets would have cost more than they had. David had assured his wife that the car would make it, and they had packed sandwiches and juice boxes for the children to make it a special adventure. William listened intently as Margaret shared these details, understanding more clearly than ever how much the invitation to the charity event had meant to this family. For David and Sarah, it wasn't just recognition for their volunteer work. It was validation that their efforts mattered, that their contributions to their community were valued. They had been willing to risk their unreliable car for the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. After leaving Margaret's house, William and Catherine walked slowly down the street, reading the messages left by neighbors and strangers alike. One note from a local teacher read, "Sarah, you taught us all that every child deserves someone who believes in them." Another, from a food bank volunteer, said, "David, your kindness fed more than just hungry stomachs. You fed hope." Children had left toys and drawings alongside the flowers. A small wooden train sat among the teddy bears, with a note that read, "For James, so you can have adventures in heaven." A coloring book and crayons were wrapped in plastic with a message, "For Emma, because you love to make beautiful pictures." As they continued down the street, more neighbors emerged from their homes. Without being asked, they began sharing their own memories of the family. A teenage boy mentioned how David had helped him fix his bicycle when he couldn't afford to take it to a repair shop. A young mother talked about Sarah tutoring her daughter after school when she was struggling with reading, never accepting payment despite the family's own financial difficulties. Each story painted a clearer picture of who the Hartwells really were. They weren't wealthy or famous, but they had enriched their community in countless small ways. They had given their time, their energy, and their hearts to making life better for others, often when they had little to spare themselves. The local imam from the nearby mosque approached them, introducing himself and explaining that although the Hartwells weren't members of his congregation, they had volunteered to help serve meals during Ramadan. He spoke of David's quiet dignity as he worked alongside people of different faiths, asking respectful questions about Islamic traditions and ensuring that all the food met halal requirements. Sarah had organized books and activities for the children who came with their families, creating a small library corner in the community hall. Catherine was particularly moved by a conversation with a group of Sarah's former students, now teenagers, who had heard about the tragedy and came to leave flowers. They spoke of how their teacher had made them feel special and capable, how she had seen potential in them when others had given up. One girl mentioned that Sarah had attended her graduation ceremony the previous year, cheering from the audience like a proud parent. As the afternoon wore on, William and Catherine realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The Hartwell family's death had brought their entire community together in a way that transcended social, economic, and cultural boundaries. People who might never have spoken to each other were sharing stories and comforting one another. The tragedy had revealed the profound impact that one family's kindness had made on hundreds of lives. A local photographer who had been discreetly documenting the tribute asked if he could speak with them. He explained that he wanted to create a permanent record of the community's response, not for publication but as something that could be given to the extended Hartwell family. William and Catherine offered to help fund the project, ensuring that every message, every drawing, and every tribute would be preserved. As the day drew to a close, they made one final stop at the local food bank where David had volunteered. The manager, a woman named Helen, showed them around the facility with obvious pride. She explained how David had reorganized their storage system, making it more efficient and allowing them to help more families. He had also started a small garden behind the building where they grew fresh vegetables to supplement the packaged goods they distributed. Helen mentioned that David had been planning to expand the garden, having secured permission from the local council to use an adjacent empty lot. He had spent weeks drawing up plans and researching which vegetables would grow best in the local soil. The project was meant to be his legacy, a way to provide fresh, healthy food for families who often had to choose between nutrition and affordability. The visit had given William and Catherine a deeper understanding of who the Hartwell family truly were and what their loss meant to their community. They had seen firsthand how ordinary people could make an extraordinary difference through simple acts of kindness and dedication. The family's death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a loss felt by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by their generosity. The following morning, William and Catherine sat in their private study at Kensington Palace, surrounded by notebooks filled with stories from their Manchester visit. Catherine had barely slept, her mind replaying every conversation, every tear-filled memory shared by the Hartwell family's neighbors and friends. She kept thinking about Margaret's words. They weren't rich in money, but they were rich in love. William had spent the early hours researching the drunk driver responsible for the tragedy, Mark Stevens. A 34-year-old businessman from London had been drinking at an expensive restaurant before getting behind the wheel of his luxury car. He had 2 previous driving violations and had ignored multiple taxi offers from the restaurant staff. The contrast between his reckless privilege and the Hartwell family's selfless service felt like a painful representation of society's inequalities. Their private secretary entered quietly, carrying a folder of messages that had arrived overnight. Word of their unannounced visit to Manchester had spread through social media, not through official channels but through grateful residents who had witnessed their genuine compassion. The messages weren't the usual formal correspondence addressed to royalty, but heartfelt notes from ordinary people, thanking them for caring enough to visit. One message particularly caught Catherine's attention. It was from a teacher in Wales who had driven 4 hours to Manchester with her class to leave flowers and letters for the Hartwell children. She wrote about how the tragedy had prompted conversations with her students about kindness, community service, and the importance of helping others. The children had made cards with messages like, "Thank you for teaching us that helping others makes the world better," and "We promise to be kind, like you were." Another message came from a group of teenagers in Scotland who had organized a charity drive for their local food bank, inspired by David Hartwell's volunteer work. They had collected more donations in one weekend than the food bank typically received in a month. Similar initiatives were being reported from communities across the country, as people channeled their grief into positive action. Catherine realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Hartwell family's story had sparked a national movement of compassion. People weren't just mourning the loss. They were actively working to ensure that the family's legacy of kindness would continue. It was exactly what David and Sarah would have wanted, but the irony that it took their deaths to inspire such widespread generosity was almost too painful to bear. That afternoon, Catherine made a decision that would define her response to the tragedy. She called the manager of the charity organization the Hartwells had been traveling to visit and proposed something that had never been done before in royal protocol. She wanted to attend the memorial service that the family's relatives were planning, not as a representative of the monarchy, but as a private citizen paying her respects. The memorial service was scheduled for the following week at the small community center where David had volunteered and Sarah had taught reading classes. The venue could only accommodate about 200 people, but thousands were expected to gather outside. Catherine's team initially worried about security and logistics, but she was adamant that the service should remain exactly as the family had planned, without any royal modifications. William supported his wife's decision completely. He had been equally moved by their Manchester visit and felt that traditional royal protocol would be inadequate for honoring the Hartwell family. They both understood that this wasn't about public relations or royal duties. It was about human decency and showing respect for people who had embodied the best of human nature. The days leading up to the memorial service saw an outpouring of support that amazed even seasoned charity workers. Donations flowed into organizations that the Hartwells had supported, often accompanied by notes explaining that contributors wanted to continue the family's work. The local food bank received enough donations to operate for 6 months. Sarah's school received books, supplies, and funding for new reading programs. Catherine spent those days working quietly with her team to establish something that would ensure the family's legacy lived on. The Hartwell Foundation would provide grants to community volunteers and grassroots organizations, particularly those working with families facing financial hardship. The foundation would operate differently from typical royal charities, focusing on small, local initiatives rather than large, high-profile projects. On the morning of the memorial service, Catherine chose her outfit carefully. She wore a simple navy dress and a small pin that belonged to her grandmother, someone who had always emphasized the importance of service to others. She and William traveled to Manchester in an ordinary car, without the usual royal convoy that would disrupt the community gathering. They arrived 30 minutes before the service began, entering through a side door to avoid disrupting the crowds gathering outside. Inside the community center, they were struck by the personal touches that made the space feel like a celebration of the family's life, rather than a formal memorial. Children's artwork covered the walls. Photos showed the Hartwells at various community events, and a table displayed items that represented their interests: books, gardening tools, and handmade crafts. The service itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Instead of formal eulogies, friends and neighbors shared personal stories. Margaret spoke about the Sunday morning visits that had brightened her entire week. A young man talked about how David had helped him find confidence when he was struggling after losing his job. One of Sarah's colleagues read from a letter she had written to parents, encouraging them to read with their children every day because books are magic carpets that can take us anywhere. Catherine found herself crying openly as she listened to these testimonies. Each story revealed another facet of the family's impact on their community. They hadn't needed wealth or status to make a difference. They had simply shown up consistently, with open hearts and willing hands. During the service, a recording was played of Emma reading a story aloud at a school event. Her 7-year-old voice was clear and confident as she read about a little girl who wanted to make the world more colorful. It was heartbreakingly appropriate, as Emma herself had made her world more colorful through her kindness and joy. When the service concluded, Catherine did something that would be remembered for years to come. Instead of making a formal exit, she and William joined the crowd outside, standing among the thousands of people who had come to pay their respects. For nearly an hour, they moved through the crowd, speaking quietly with families, listening to more stories, and accepting the handmade gifts that people had brought. A young girl approached Catherine shyly, holding a drawing she had made of the Hartwell family as angels watching over their community. Catherine knelt down to the child's level, accepting the gift with tears in her eyes and promising that it would be treasured. The moment was captured by someone's phone camera and quickly spread across social media, becoming a symbol of genuine compassion that transcended social barriers. As they prepared to leave, the crowd spontaneously began singing, "You'll Never Walk Alone," the anthem that had become associated with community solidarity. The sound of thousands of voices joined in harmony was overwhelming, representing not just grief, but hope that the Hartwell family's message of love and service would continue to inspire others. In the weeks that followed, the impact of William and Catherine's response continued to grow. The Hartwell Foundation received applications from community volunteers across the country, each proposing projects that would help others in need. Schools began incorporating lessons about community service into their curricula, using the Hartwell family as an example of how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences. Perhaps most significantly, the tragedy prompted a national conversation about how society valued and supported people like David and Sarah Hartwell. Their story highlighted the contrast between those who gave generously despite having little and those who took recklessly, despite having much. It challenged everyone to consider how they could contribute to their communities and support those who dedicated their lives to helping others. Catherine often returned to Margaret's words about being rich in love rather than money. The Hartwell family's true wealth had been measured in the lives they touched, the kindness they spread, and the hope they inspired. Their death had been a devastating loss, but their legacy had become a powerful force for good that would continue long after the news cycle moved on to other stories. The silent gesture of William and Catherine visiting as ordinary citizens rather than royalty had spoken louder than any formal statement could have. It demonstrated that genuine compassion knows no boundaries of class or status, and that the most powerful response to tragedy is often the simplest: showing up, listening, and caring enough to act. In honoring the Hartwell family's memory, they had reminded an entire nation of the difference that ordinary kindness could make in an often difficult world.